All things, physical and mental, including body and mind, are objects and therefore can be experienced. The real self or spirit or God or witness consciousness is the experiencer or the knower. If the experience is poverty, how can God experience it when he or she is the source of all things? How can God experience hatred when he or she is all love? How can God experience death when he or she is life? How can God experience sadness when God is all joy? Please explain.
Okay, I'll take that. It's a no, it comes from a Vedantic perspective, but I'll request the rabbi to chip in afterwards. And basically, this is a question about it's a question of evil in any philosophy, especially in any religion, theistic religion especially. You have to explain why there is suffering when God exists. An all good and all powerful God, why would there be suffering? So I'll give two answers. One straightforward from a dualistic Vedanta perspective, where the answer is pretty straightforward. God doesn't experience poverty, God doesn't experience unhappiness, God doesn't experience sadness. It is we who experience poverty, unhappiness, and sadness. Dualistic, Who, after all, if you look around, who is sad? Who is suffering from poverty and deprivation? Who is experiencing misery? It's human beings. So, sentient beings experience suffering. God does not. So that resolves the problem from a dualistic perspective. But why do sentient beings experience suffering? Multiple answers can be there. From an Indian perspective, the most pervasive answer, most common answer would be karma, causality. We experience suffering because of our past karma. We know this particular theory that in past lives, we have accumulated negative karma and that results in unpleasantness in this present life. We have accumulated good karma and that results in pleasantness. And if you complain that there's too little pleasantness and too much unpleasantness in my life, what does that say about you or your past lives? So that's one answer. That's just one. That's the surface level answer. But this question was not put from that perspective. This question was put from a Advaitic perspective, where it seems paradoxical. After all, from an Advaitic perspective, sentient beings and God are not separate. There is only one reality, that is Brahman, existence, consciousness, bliss. And so how could that Brahman, which is presumably limitless and perfect, how could that Brahman experience poverty and sadness and misery and hatred and all of that? Remember, little technicality here, that Brahman, which is one, non-dual, appears as this world of appearances through the mediation of Maya. Maya is that which projects the one as the many. Since it projects the one as the many, it projects in different ways. With Maya, that same Brahman is called God. And yes, that God, which is similar to the God of dualistic religions, in Vedantic terms, Saguna Brahman, Brahman with attributes, is all powerful, all loving, all good, beyond poverty. That God does not experience poverty or suffering or sadness. But that Maya also projects that same limitless consciousness as so many sentient beings. And those sentient beings, they undergo spiritual evolution until they realize their oneness with the divinity, with the ultimate reality. And as we undergo spiritual evolution, we go through various experiences. A more subtle, little more difficult, but more sort of final kind of answer is this. The difference between the divinity and our present state of experiences is not a real difference. It's a difference between knowledge and ignorance. So in ignorance, we are these sentient beings struggling in a world of strife and suffering. When we realize what we truly are and what this world truly is and what God truly is, we realize one non-dual Brahman. When we realize that, these questions, I won't say they're solved, but they're dissolved. Notice, these questions which we are asking, for those who we consider to be enlightened, they don't have these questions. These questions are on our side. They have presumably found the answers and they don't seem to be bothered by these questions anymore. So there's a difference between knowledge and ignorance. In ignorance, we seem to be in this world of strife and struggle. When we become enlightened, we realize that we are one with Brahman. And this is a world of appearance, maybe at best a school for spiritual evolution. That would be an Advaitic answer. But it's a deep question. In theology, in different world religions, this is called the problem of evil. With an all-powerful and all-loving and all-good God, why should there be so much suffering in the world? That's the essential form of that question. I'm sure the Rabbi has given a lot of thought to this in his studies and his research.
Not sure it's me who's given a lot of thought. I think world religions, as you just said, have given a lot of thought. So I'm going to start with Christianity, and then I'm going to move to Judaism. And really the question is, at the end of the day, is, like you said, is evil real, or what is the scope of experiencing? In theory, from the Advaita perspective, if God is everything, then God is also the poverty and the pain and the death and everything. Then everything would be included in that everythingness of God. So really the foundation of the question is a dualistic foundation, because the question was posed, if God is good, how can he experience bad? But if God is everything, then he can experience both good and bad without any distinction. So really that was a dualistic question attempting to frame a monistic view of God, maybe not fully successfully. How do other religions deal with this? So, did Jesus suffer on the cross? I don't know if we should do a poll in the room or not, but did Jesus suffer on the cross? If he was God, how could he suffer on the cross? If he didn't suffer on the cross, then what's the point? So this question was a question that Christian theology struggled with in the early centuries. There was a position called docetic. Docetic means it only gave an appearance that he was suffering. It looked as though he was suffering, which fits in with what you said, Swamiji, about the appearance from our perspective. But then there was a counterpush that said, no, for this to really be, Jesus had to really suffer. In other words, if you talk in terms of God coming down here and experiencing humanity, God has to experience humanity to the full. So Christianity has to come up with various answers of how the divine in its fullness can make room for this limitation. And one important notion that appears already in the New Testament from Paul is the notion of kenosis, an emptying out. God empties himself out from that fullness in order to take on that limitation, which of course, if you couple that with an Advaita Vedanta perspective, is really not an issue, because that emptying out itself is part of the divine. And a Jewish answer that will be very similar appeals to the notion of tzimtzum. Tzimtzum means divine self-contraction. So God empties himself from the fullness in order to create reality. So the Kabbalistic theory of creation, as propounded by the great Kabbalistic sage, the Ari, a 16th century great Kabbalist from Tzfat, sees the first step in creation as God creating an empty space within which creation happens. And within that, you get the kind of dualism where there's God and there's creation, because prior to that, there was only divinity. But in order for creation to be real, in other words, what Swamiji spoke about, the shift from nirguna to the saguna, from the non-dual to the dual, there's something that isn't appealed to by the force of Maya, but actually by a force of a real happening. So in the same way that kenosis is understood as a real happening in the divine, so tzimtzum is a real happening in reality where there's room that's made for creation, and within that come the origin of all limitations, evil, etc., suffering, etc. This then plays out, still on Jewish Kabbalistic ground, in the fact that we have different faces of God. So while the absolute God will not suffer, but within the divine figure, is the aspect of the Shekhinah that I referred to earlier, suffers with us. It is the suffering face of God, if you will. It's the creative aspect, but it's also the aspect that comes together with us and joins in our reality and therefore suffers with us. So we can simultaneously speak in a matter that's analogous to what Swami said, of God being beyond all suffering, beyond all limitation, and at the same time God also undertaking and entering and being with that, and that is what is known as the exile of the Shekhinah and the suffering of the Shekhinah. So the answer is that great religions, as Swamiji says, struggle with that, and they provide, I would say, parallel responses.
My name is Hank Citron. I also studied at the Tel Aviv University, but a few years before you, I think. I have two things I'd like to get your opinion on. when I was following the singing that began, or the chanting that began in this meeting, I noticed that every word talked about I. In Judaism, the word is we. We see ourselves collectively as praying as an organization, and we, by definition, attempt to make a better world, spiritually and otherwise. From an Eastern position, yours seems to be more of a self-developing individual spirituality is the first issue of business, and secondly, as you point out, might be the coming of a social attitude. That was one thing that I had in my mind, and while I'm talking about that, I forgot it, so if you can respond to this, I'll think of the second. Well, you'll motivate me.
It's all because you went to Hebrew University before me.
That might be it. That might be it. In the beginning of the Hebrew University, as a matter of fact.
God bless you. This is a very, very, very interesting observation. It's your first time here?
It's my second. My daughter is very active here and has brought me here earlier one time.
Good. Okay, so I just want to say one thing for understanding the sense of the I here locally, and then I'll address your key question, and that is that there are two I's. There's lower I and higher I. And I think what's fundamental to the people who inhabit this space is this quest for the higher I, the Atman, the divine self, as opposed to the lower ego self. So when someone comes from the outside and reads this, you might think of the I and the lower self. And it could be that some of the texts that you read go in that direction. But the ultimate focus of the I is because of the centrality of the notion of self and the unity of self with the divine in the Hindu thought. So getting these two I's together, that creates the great Jewish conundrum of I. Yeah.
well aware of that.
Okay. Now to the substance of your question. I said earlier in my presentation that I think Judaism has what to give Hinduism, and I think you've just introduced a very important element, which is the sense of community. For whatever ways Hinduism is organized within itself, and I'm happy to get pushed back on this, but there isn't that same awareness of community and collectivity. And that, of course, stems from the fact of what is the starting unit of the religion. The religion of Judaism is the religion of the people of Israel, and there's a profound sense in which the individual is derived from the collective, and therefore the process is initially that of the collective, and then it extends to the individual. And this finds expression in a way that you didn't say, but I think you implied, in that our key prayers, the Amidah, the Shmoneh Esrei, that's recited thrice daily, and all the major prayers are recited in the first person plural form, we rather than I. So there is a very strong sense that here's a community standing before it. Now that's Judaism's strength, that's Judaism's weakness, because at times that strength could eclipse the spiritual process of the individual, and it could also eclipse the view of the others because of over self-involvement with that community. And still, its strength is that collective sense. And the collective sense is not just we go out and serve the world, as you said. That's already a much more, shall we say, contemporary tikkun, which is a characteristic of non-Orthodox denominations. It's really that everything, our Torah learning and our quest for Messiah and our redemptive process, so it's all collectively oriented. So there is, I think, something very important in your observation. However, when you view the sequence of the prayer, the Jewish prayer, it goes through the Amidah. Are you familiar with the Amidah?
Sure.
Yeah. You go through the... Excuse me? Okay. So you go through the process of the Amidah, you finish on Varechta Yisrael B'Shalom, and then you start with a set of prayers that's formulated in first person singular. Guard my tongue from speaking evil, a request for humility, a request for opening the heart in Torah, a request for purification of the heart. So you move from collective to individual. So, in other words, the fullness of the spiritual process, even as illustrated in the liturgy, is a move from that collective, not just a collective of activism, but also we first stand before God as a community that has a history, a mission, a covenant, a purpose, a story, a wound, a suffering, a quest for exile, and a large part of our prayers is about that quest for redemption. I said quest for exile, I meant quest for redemption. But then the individual expression of that is the quest for purification of the heart and the gaining of knowledge and repentance, all of which are expressed in the individual. So there is this balance, and different points in the history of Judaism, especially the Hasidic movement, places a much greater emphasis on the individual and the personal transformation. So you pitched the question from the perspective of the work of Tikkun, and might come back to you, which goes back to Brother Texas's tension between activism. No, this is not a put down. Between activism and spirituality. That itself finds expression between on the Jewish side, between the individual and the collective, and different emphases where you emphasize the activism, but the spiritual movement of Judaism is emphasizing the spiritual transformation. The more you emphasize spiritual transformation, the more you move towards the individual. And therefore, it's not a mistake or an accident that when you presented your question in terms of the first person plural, you didn't appeal to the prayer, which I picked up from your words to lift up as an important element, but you picked up on social activism. And that's precisely what's corrected when you speak of the spiritual process, that even in Jewish text takes you much more back to the first person singular.